The clock struck 9:45, and Ruth's house was plunged into an eerie silence. The thick curtains on the first-floor windows blocked the view of the garden, where the street lamps cast long, ominous shadows. Ruth was in the kitchen, kneeling on the cold marble floor with a worn brush in one hand and a bucket of dirty water at her side. Her knees were wrapped in thin bandages, trying to relieve the constant pain caused by arthritis. Every movement was torture, but she couldn't stop. Genevieve watched from the kitchen doorway, a glass of wine in her hand and a cruel smile on her bright red lips. "I've already spoken, Ruth," she said, her voice a venomous whisper that cut through the air like a knife. "If I find one more stain on this floor, you'll spend the night scrubbing it again. I want it shining like new." Ruth didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, but inside, a whirlwind of emotions was consuming her. Anger, shame, fear, all mixed together as she held back tears. Resistance was futile. Genevieve knew exactly how to crush any shred of courage Ruth might try to muster. She thought of Thomas, her late husband, and the house they had built together. The marble under her hands was a gift he had insisted on including in the kitchen renovation. "You deserve something nice, Ruth," he had said years ago, when money was tighter but their love was abundant. Now that same floor had become a symbol of his humiliation. Genevieve stepped forward, her high heels echoing in the empty room. She kicked the bucket, splashing the dirty water all over the kitchen. "Look what you've done," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "Now you'll have to start all over again, and fast. Jeremy will be home in an hour, and you know how much he hates mess." Ruth felt tears welling up, but held them back. She knew that any show of weakness would only feed Genevieve's sadistic pleasure. The young woman leaned over, bringing her face close to Ruth's, and whispered, "And remember, if you dare say anything to Jeremy, I'll make sure he never speaks to you again. Understood?" Ruth nodded, the lump in her throat preventing her from speaking. Genevieve laughed, satisfied, and left the kitchen, her footsteps disappearing down the corridor towards the living room. Later that evening, when she had finally finished cleaning the floor, Ruth slowly made her way up to her bedroom. Each step was a battle against the pain radiating from her joints. When she got there, she noticed something different. On the bedside table, there was a small white box with a note stuck on the lid. She picked up the paper, which trembled in her aged hands, and read the words written in blue pen. "Ruth, you don't deserve this. These cameras could be your chance to prove what's going on. Don't be afraid, I'm with you. Tonya." Ruth's heart raced. Her neighbor, Tonya, was a determined and practical woman. But Ruth never imagined that she could go to such lengths to help her. The elderly woman carefully opened the box and found small, discreet cameras that could easily be hidden in the rooms of the house. Ruth sat on the bed and held the cameras for a long time, pondering. Her instinct told her not to accept the help. Genevieve was cunning and dangerous. If she found out, she could retaliate cruelly, but at the same time, Ruth knew she had to do something. She couldn't stand living in fear any longer, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. That night, as she prepared for bed, Ruth was overwhelmed by a flood of memories. She thought of Thomas and the life they had built together. He was a hard-working man, always concerned with making sure Ruth had everything she needed. "You deserve the world, my love," he used to say, kissing her forehead after a long day at work. Ruth remembered the sunny afternoons in the garden, where Jeremy would run after the family dog, while she and Thomas watched with smiles on their faces. Back then, the house was full of life, laughter, and love. Now it was full of shouting, insults, and silence. She also thought of Jeremy, the sweet, gentle boy who always protected her. How could he not see what Genevieve was doing? Ruth knew he loved his wife, but the thought that he could be so blind to the abuse devastated her. Finally, Ruth made a decision. In the morning, she would install the cameras. It was a huge risk, but she couldn't live like that any longer. Tonya was right. It was the only way to expose the truth. The next morning, while Ruth was working up the courage to hide the cameras around the house, Genevieve entered her room without knocking, as she usually did. She was holding an expensive dress, with the tag still hanging off. "I need you to iron this," she ordered, throwing the garment on the bed. "And be careful not to burn it. This cost more than you'd spend in a whole month." Ruth said nothing. She took the dress and went to the sewing room, where the iron was. While she did what Genevieve had told her, she mentally reviewed the places where she could put the cameras. She needed to be discreet, but effective. Genevieve, on the other hand, was on the phone in the living room, speaking in low tones. As Ruth passed through the hallway, she overheard a fragment of the conversation. "Yes, everything is almost ready. I just need her signature, and then we'll take care of the rest." The words hung in the air, like an invisible threat. Ruth knew something was going on, something much bigger than just the daily abuse. Genevieve was up to something, and she needed to find out what it was. When night fell, Ruth and Tonya met briefly in the backyard to discuss the plan. The cameras would be installed the next day with Tonya's help. Ruth felt the weight of fear in her chest, but also a spark of hope. Perhaps, for the first time in months, she could imagine a future in which she would be free. As Ruth walked back to the house, the sound of Genevieve's laughter echoed through the living room. The young woman was watching a television program, relaxed and carefree, as if she didn't have a single problem in the world. Ruth climbed the stairs in silence, but deep down she knew the battle had only just begun. The day dawned with a grey sky covering Spokane, Washington, like a heavy blanket. That morning, Ruth Williams watched the fine rain pouring down the wide windows of her living room. It was one of her favorite parts of the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows allowing her to gaze out over the vast garden that she and her husband, Thomas, had cultivated together over the decades. Roses, hydrangeas, and azaleas framed the main entrance, a living memory of the love and care they had both devoted to the house. But today, the house seemed strange to Ruth, almost as if it were no longer hers, and in a way it wasn't. Since Jeremy and Genevieve moved in, what had once been a home full of happy memories had become a silent battlefield. The smiles, the fireside chats, and the moments of peace had been replaced by shouts, orders, and an oppressive silence. Ruth was now a prisoner in her own home, her autonomy stolen by her daughter-in-law. Ruth's house was not just a building, it was a symbol of a lifetime of work and sacrifice. Thomas, a renowned architect in the region, had designed every detail with care and dedication. "I don't just want a house," he told Ruth. "I want this to be our legacy, a place where our family will always feel safe," and so it was for many years. The hardwood floors, the crystal chandelier in the dining room, the built-in bookshelves in the library filled with books Thomas had collected during his travels around the world. Everything in that house told a story. Even the smell was familiar, a mixture of wood wax and the light scent of fresh flowers that Ruth always made a point of putting in a vase in the entrance hall. But now, the space that had meant so much to Ruth had been transformed. Genevieve, with her dominant personality, began to change the essence of the house little by little. The sofa that Ruth had chosen with such care had been replaced by a modern, cold model. Family photographs disappeared from the shelves, replaced by generic decorative objects. Genevieve said it was to modernize the environment, but for Ruth it was a deliberate effort to erase her presence. Jeremy, Ruth's only son, was the reason for her patience and resilience. From an early age he was always kind and protective, the kind of child who helped his classmates at school and brought his mother flowers on Mother's Day. Thomas always said, "Jeremy has his mother's heart." Ruth believed that to the bottom of her soul. But the man who now lived under the same roof seemed like a stranger. Since marrying Genevieve, Jeremy had changed. He worked long hours as a mechanic, and when he was at home, he spent most of his time in his room or in the garage, leaving Genevieve in charge of the house. Ruth rarely had a meaningful conversation with him, and when she tried to express her concern, he would shrug it off. "Genevieve only wants what's best for us, Mom," he would say. "She's trying to help." Ruth knew that Genevieve had manipulated Jeremy, but she still clung to the hope that one day he would see the truth. That hope was what kept her going. Genevieve was a beautiful woman with a magnetic presence that attracted people. Tall, elegant, with neat black hair and an impeccable smile, she seemed perfect to anyone who saw her from the outside. But behind this facade, there was a frightening coldness. She began to isolate Ruth soon after she moved in. "Don't worry about a thing, Ruth," she would say with false sweetness. "I'll take care of everything. You just need to rest." At first, Ruth accepted the help, believing that Genevieve was really there to make her life easier. But she quickly realized that there was an intention behind every gesture. Genevieve took control of the household finances, claiming that Ruth was no longer able to handle the numbers. She forbade Ruth to go out alone under the pretext of safety. Even visits from Tonya, the neighbor, became a point of contention. "She just wants to take advantage of you," said Genevieve, referring to Tonya. "These people don't understand what it means to look after someone like you." The humiliation got to the point where Ruth had to ask permission to use the phone or access her own documents. Genevieve monitored everything with a critical and judgmental eye, always finding something to criticize or complain about. On the other side of the fence, Tonya watched everything with increasing attention. The neighbor, a woman in her late 50s, had a practical, straightforward manner. Tonya was a widow and lived alone, which gave her plenty of time to pay attention to what was going on next door. She began to notice changes in Ruth soon after Genevieve arrived. The elderly woman, who used to happily tend the garden, was now rarely seen outside the house. When Tonya managed to speak to Ruth, she could see the fear in her friend's eyes. "Is everything all right, Ruth?" asked Tonya. But Ruth, always careful, just smiled and said, "Yes, everything's fine. Don't worry about me." Tonya knew it wasn't true. She saw Ruth's clothes becoming more and more disheveled, the dark circles deepening on her face. One day, while she was watering the plants, she heard Genevieve's screams coming from inside the house. Her instinct told her that something had to be done. That afternoon, Tonya decided to act. She bought discreet cameras and went to Ruth's house, carrying a small box. When Ruth opened the door, she was surprised to see the serious expression on her neighbor's face. "I brought this for you," said Tonya, handing over the box. "You need proof of what's going on here." Ruth hesitated, looking at the box as if it were a bomb about to explode. But Tonya held her hand and said, "I know you're afraid, but you're not alone. I'm going to help you." Ruth's heart was heavy, torn between the fear of reprisals and the hope of a way out. She knew that Genevieve wasn't just cruel, she was dangerous. But at that moment, looking into Tonya's eyes, she saw something she hadn't felt for a long time. Support. "All right," Ruth replied, her voice trembling. "Let's do it." Tonya smiled and squeezed her hand. Together they began to plan where to install the cameras. Ruth knew it would be risky, but she also knew it was her only chance of recovering the life Genevieve had stolen. The installation of the cameras took place on a cold, cloudy morning. Tonya arrived early, carrying a small backpack containing the necessary equipment. Ruth greeted her at the back door, glancing nervously around to make sure Genevieve wasn't nearby. "She's out shopping," Ruth said quietly, as if the walls had ears. "But I never know how long she'll be." Tonya gave Ruth a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Don't worry. We'll be quick and discreet." The two moved around the house carefully, setting up the cameras in strategic places. One was placed in the kitchen, where Genevieve often attacked Ruth verbally. Another was hidden in the living room, where she often made suspicious phone calls. The third was placed in Ruth's bedroom, as Tonya believed Genevieve might be going through the elderly woman's personal belongings. As Tonya adjusted one of the cameras, Ruth watched with a mixture of hope and fear. "If she finds out about this," began Ruth, but her voice faltered. Tonya turned and faced her firmly. "She won't find out, and even if she does, we'll be one step ahead. Ruth, you deserve justice, and I'm going to make sure you get it." That same evening, Tonya reviewed the first few hours of footage in the comfort of her own home. What she saw confirmed her suspicions. Genevieve didn't just treat Ruth with contempt. She seemed to delight in finding new ways to humiliate her. In one of the recordings, Genevieve demanded that Ruth wash a huge pile of clothes by hand, claiming that the washing machine was broken, even though she knew Ruth could barely stand for long periods. "If I find out you've used the machine, you'll be sorry," Genevieve would say, her eyes shining with cruelty. Another recording showed Genevieve on the phone, her voice low and full of secrets. "Yes, everything is almost ready," she said. "I just need her to sign the documents. After that, there won't be any more problems." Tonya paused the video, feeling her stomach turn. There was something big going on, something that went beyond the daily abuse. She knew she had to take this to the police. With the recordings in hand, Tonya contacted Detective Michael Adams, an experienced police officer who had dealt with cases of elder abuse before. On hearing Tonya's account and watching the recordings, Adams immediately realized that there was something deeper going on. "This woman isn't just abusive," he said, after reviewing the videos. "She's up to something big. We need to find out who she really is." The investigation began with an analysis of Genevieve's background. Using the little data provided by Tonya, Adams's team soon found a worrying match. Genevieve, whose real name was Gabriela Farina, was an international criminal wanted in Guatemala for a series of frauds and abuses. She had already defrauded several families. Using the same modus operandi, she approached vulnerable men, gained their trust, married them, and exploited their families to steal goods and property. "What we're dealing with here is a calculating sociopath," Adams explained to Tonya. "She takes advantage of people's kindness and naivety to achieve her goals." Tonya was stunned. The woman who pretended to be a devoted wife and loving caregiver was in fact a dangerous predator. "We need to act fast," she said, determined. "Ruth is in danger." As the investigation continued, Genevieve seemed to intensify her efforts to break Ruth. One day, over breakfast, Genevieve placed a folder of documents on the table and pushed it towards Ruth. "You're going to sign this," she ordered. "It's to ensure that the house is transferred into my name in case anything happens to you. It's just a precaution." Ruth froze. "But this house is all I have. Thomas and I—" "Thomas is dead, Ruth," Genevieve cut in without a hint of empathy. "And Jeremy agrees that this is for the best. Now sign it." Ruth hesitated, but Genevieve stepped closer, her eyes narrowed and full of menace. "If you don't sign, Ruth, I guarantee that Jeremy will never look you in the face again. Do you want to spend your last years completely alone?" Ruth felt her heart squeeze, but something inside her refused to budge. She knew that Tonya and the police were working to help her, and she needed to buy time. "I need to review the documents first," she said, trying to sound confident. "Can you give me a day or two?" Genevieve narrowed her eyes, suspicious, but finally gave in. "All right, but don't take too long." That evening, Ruth ran to the fence separating her house from Tonya's, with the documents hidden under a coat. "She wants me to transfer the house into her name," she said, her voice shaking. Tonya picked up the papers and quickly flipped through them. "Of course," she muttered indignantly. "This isn't a precaution. It's theft." The two decided to hand the documents over to the police immediately. Detective Adams, upon analyzing them, confirmed that the papers were part of Genevieve's scheme. "This proves that she's trying to take possession of the house," he said. "Now we have enough to arrest her." but Adams wanted more. He knew that Gabriella had a network of accomplices, and he wanted to dismantle the whole scheme. "We need to catch her in the act," he explained. "If we can record her admitting her crimes, that will be the final blow." Meanwhile, Genevieve began to suspect that something was wrong. She noticed that Ruth was more reserved and that Tonya seemed to be more present than usual. One day, when she entered Ruth's room, she found the old lady rummaging through a drawer in a hurry. "What are you hiding?" asked Genevieve, her voice full of suspicion. Nothing," stammered Ruth, trying to keep calm. "Just looking for my glasses." Genevieve leaned over, her eyes fixed on Ruth. "I hope you're not thinking of doing something stupid, Ruth, because if you are, things could get very ugly for you." Ruth didn't reply, but inside she felt that the siege was closing in. Every day the tension grew. Genevieve was becoming more suspicious, and Ruth knew that the moment of the final confrontation was approaching. The next morning came with a heavy atmosphere, as if Ruth's own house was anticipating the storm to come. Genevieve was more impatient than ever, and Ruth, despite her constant fear, felt that the end of this nightmare was near. The police now had enough evidence to act, but they needed more. A confession from Genevieve, captured on video, would be the final piece to guarantee her conviction. Ruth was in the kitchen pretending to wash the dishes when Genevieve suddenly entered. Her eyes were sharp, as if they could pierce whatever secret Ruth was trying to hide. She was holding the papers she had left the night before. "It's been long enough, Ruth," she said, slamming the documents down on the table. "You're going to sign these now." Ruth turned around slowly, holding a plate in her trembling hands. I need more time. I haven't read everything yet." Genevieve let out a short, cruel laugh. "Who do you think you're fooling, old woman? I know you don't want to sign, but let me be very clear. If you don't, not only will I guarantee that Jeremy will never speak to you again, but I'll also make your life an even bigger hell than it already is. Do you understand?" Ruth tried to keep her composure, but she felt her heart racing. She knew she needed to resist, but she also needed the confession that Tonya and Detective Adams had asked for. "Why do you need the house in your name?" "It doesn't make sense," he risked asking. Genevieve moved closer, her face now just a few centimeters from Ruth's. "Because I deserve it. This house is huge and wasted on you. Jeremy and I are young, and we need a place like this. You've already lived your life, Ruth. Now it's our turn." Ruth felt her blood boil. "Thomas and I built this house. He designed it for me, for our family." "Thomas is dead," Genevieve shouted, interrupting her. "And you soon will be too if you keep making things difficult." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Ruth knew it was time to act. Tonya, who had arranged a signal with Ruth to monitor the live recordings, was on the other side of the fence with her laptop. As soon as she heard the argument escalate, she picked up the phone and called Detective Adams. "It's happening," she said, her voice laden with urgency. "She's putting pressure on Ruth. It looks like she's going to confess." Adams answered immediately. "We're on our way. Tell Ruth to stand her ground." Inside the house, Ruth mustered up all the courage she had. "Do you think you'll get away with this?" she asked, her voice firm despite her fear. "What if Jeremy finds out what you really are?" Genevieve laughed again, this time with more intensity. "Jeremy's an idiot. I've manipulated him from day one, and he's never suspected a thing. Everything I do is for me, Ruth, not for him, and certainly not for you." Ruth swallowed, but kept her gaze fixed on Genevieve. "What do you mean?" Genevieve stepped back, leaning against the sink, as if proud of her own actions. "You know what? I'll tell you why you can't do anything. I've already gotten everything I wanted. This house will be mine, and after I sell it, I'll move on. I've done it before, and you won't be the last." Ruth barely had time to react when she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Genevieve heard it too, her expression instantly changing from confidence to panic. She ran to the window, pulling back the curtain to look outside. When she saw police cars surrounding the house, she stood motionless for a moment before turning to Ruth with eyes full of fury. "What have you done, you miserable old woman?" he shouted, advancing towards Ruth. But before Genevieve could get to her, the front door was smashed in and the policemen burst in with guns drawn. "Hands up," they shouted. "Gabriella Farina, you're under arrest." Genevieve tried to run to the back of the house, but another group of policemen was already positioned there. She was restrained and handcuffed while shouting insults. "You can't do this. I didn't do anything wrong." Meanwhile, Ruth stood paralyzed in the corner of the kitchen, watching the scene with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Tonya ran in right behind the policeman and hugged Ruth, who finally let the tears fall. "You did it, Ruth. It's over." As Genevieve was taken to the police car, she continued to scream, trying to defend herself. But Detective Adams, who was present at the scene, had other news for her. "Your accomplice has already been arrested," he said, showing a file with photos of a man who helped Genevieve forge documents and carry out the illegal transactions. "You're both going to spend a long time in prison." Genevieve, finally realizing that she had lost, stopped screaming. Her expression changed to something darker, a bitter acceptance that her days of manipulation and power were over. After the policeman had left, taking Genevieve into custody, Ruth sat in the living room, looking out at the garden through the large windows. The sun was beginning to peek through the clouds, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. Tonya sat down next to her, holding her hand. "You were incredibly brave," she said. "Not everyone could do what you did." Ruth gave a weak smile. "I had no choice. This house, this life. Thomas always said it was ours, and I couldn't let him take it away from me." Ruth's courage and Tonya's help led to a moment of justice that had seemed impossible weeks before. Genevieve's case would make the local headlines, but for Ruth, the real triumph lay in the peace she could finally feel in her own home. She knew she still had a long way to go, but with the support of her community, she was ready to start again. This expanded version explores the growing tensions, Genevieve's confession, and the climactic moment of arrest, with rich detail and intense emotional build-up, ready to continue with the final resolution and reflection. The morning after Genevieve's arrest brought a sense of calm that Ruth had not experienced for a long time. The house, with its wide corridors and rooms full of memories, seemed her own again. Genevieve's absence was not just physical, but emotional. The silence was no longer oppressive, but a relief, like a gentle wind after a storm. Ruth woke up to the sound of the phone ringing. When she answered, she heard Tonya's warm voice on the other end of the line. "Good morning, Ruth. How are you?" "Better," Ruth replied sincerely. "I finally feel like I can breathe." Tonya smiled on the other end. "Good. We have a few things to sort out today. The police need your final statement, and Adams wants to make sure everything is completed before they take Genevieve to Guatemala." Ruth sighed, but agreed. She knew that, in order to close this chapter in her life, she had to face the final formalities. "I'll be ready in an hour." At the police station, Ruth found Detective Adams in his office, reviewing documents related to the case. He greeted her with a firm handshake. "Ruth, first of all, I want to say that you are an extraordinary woman. What you did wasn't easy, but thanks to your courage, we managed to catch not only Genevieve, but also the network of accomplices who were helping her." Ruth smiled shyly. "I just wanted my life back." Adams nodded. "And you got it? Now we need your formal statement to finalize the case. Are you ready?" Ruth hesitated for a moment. Reliving the abuse would be painful, but she knew it was necessary. For hours, she recounted everything, from the first days of Genevieve's control to the direct threats and the pressure to sign the documents. Every word brought back bitter memories, but at the same time, every detail recorded was a step towards justice. When she had finished, Adams looked at her with respect. That's more than enough. You've done your bit, Ruth. Now, we'll take care of the rest. After leaving the police station, Ruth and Tonya returned home. Jeremy was waiting in the living room with an expression of deep regret. He had been called in by the police and confronted with the evidence against Genevieve, which had finally forced him to face the truth. "Mom," he began, his voice breaking, I'm sorry. I had no idea what she was doing to you. How could I have been so blind?" Ruth felt a mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to hug him and assure him that everything was all right. But another part, the one that had endured months of abuse, wanted him to feel the weight of his neglect. "Jeremy," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you brought Genevieve into this house. You trusted her and ignored the signs. I forgive you because you're my son, but I hope you've learned from it." Jeremy nodded with tears in his eyes. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. You deserve so much more than I gave you." And then, with Genevieve arrested and her accomplice also captured, the case gained attention in the local community. Ruth's story was told in newspapers and on the news, highlighting not only the abuse she suffered, but also her courage and Tonya's vital help. Tonya suggested that Ruth use this attention to create something positive. "Why don't we start a group to help other people in your situation?" she asked one morning while they were having tea in the garden. Ruth was thoughtful. "I never imagined I could do something like this, but if my experience can help other people, maybe it's worth a try." With the support of Tonya and other neighbors, Ruth founded a support group called Voices of Resilience, focused on helping elderly people who were facing abuse or neglect. They met in Ruth's own home, which had now become a place of strength and hope. A few months later, Ruth received a letter from Guatemala. It was from a woman called Ana, whose mother had been a victim of Genevieve's years before. The letter thanked Ruth for her courage, which had helped to capture a criminal who had destroyed so many lives. Ruth read the letter in silence, sitting in her favorite armchair in the living room. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of gratitude. She realized that even in the darkness, she had managed to do something meaningful. One sunny afternoon, Ruth was sitting in the garden, surrounded by the flowers she and Thomas had planted. She was holding a photo album that Tonya had helped her organize. There were old photos of her family, of Thomas smiling in front of the fireplace, of Jeremy playing on the garden swing. And now there were new photos, too, of the support group meetings, of the people she had helped to protect. Ruth closed the album and looked up at the blue sky. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Home was again a refuge, not a prison, and although the scars remained, she knew that she had transformed her pain into something greater, a legacy of strength and justice. "Thomas," she whispered, with a soft smile, "I did it." And so Ruth's story ended, not as a victim, but as a survivor who refused to be defined by the evil she had suffered. She was, and always would be, a woman of unwavering courage.